Good evening. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Come Forth, the Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, presented by Father James Martin. We have a huge registration, which shows there's a lot of interest in this topic tonight. Thank you for joining us. There are a couple of housekeeping issues I'd like to address before we get started. The webinar will not go for more than 90 minutes, and that will include the presentation and time for questions and answers. If you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box. It may be missed if you put it into the chat box. A recording of the session will be sent to registered participants within 3 days of the session. Please check the interpretation icon if you would like to listen en français. Instructions are in the chat box. Our technical issues will be handled this evening by David Mann. Please send questions to him through the Q&A. We begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call Canada home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit, each in our own way, to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Father James Martin. He is a member of the Society of Jesus and a frequent commentator in the US and international media. He has been interviewed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he has appeared on all the major US networks and diverse outlets such as the Colbert Report. He is a member of the Synod of Bishops and recently returned from a month in Rome, where the Synod met to discuss synodality, the way in which all members of the Church participate in the Church and its mission. Father Martin will be talking to us tonight about his new book, Come Forth, the Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. On a personal note, Father Martin is a great friend of the Canadian province of the Society of Jesus. He never hesitates to say yes when we ask him for help or guidance. Jim, it's much appreciated. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's wonderful to be with you. And I always say yes to anything that Jesuits ask me or Jesuit provinces. It's very hard to say no to the Jesuits, and it's certainly our neighbors. I thought that maybe we could start with a prayer tonight. But in lieu of a prayer, it's kind of a prayer. I'd like to read something to you, and I think it should be familiar to you. I have it right here. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were now just trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. Those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been in the tomb already 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone lying across it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to him, "Unbind him and let him go." Now, unless you're totally new to Christianity, you know that is the story of the raising of Lazarus, which is the subject of my new book, Come Forth, the Promise of Jesus's Greatest Miracle. I want to say, it's wonderful en français, venez en avant. And by the way, je suis désolé que je ne peux pas parler meilleur en français, but I'm very grateful to the interpreters. When I told my mother that I was writing a book on Lazarus, she said, "Lazarus? Why Lazarus? Why a whole book on Lazarus?" So maybe a little bit of a description of what prompted me to write this book by way of introduction. When I was a young boy, and some of you with longer memories may remember this, very popular on TV was a miniseries called Jesus of Nazareth. I'm sure some of you remember it. To my mind, probably the best film depiction of Jesus's life. The Chosen comes close, but Jesus of Nazareth, which was produced in 1977 by Franco Zeffirelli, would air on television regularly. This shows how things have changed on network TV during Easter and Christmas. So Jesus of Nazareth was, I think, a 2 or 3 day, 2 or 3 night series. And to my mind, to my 16-year-old mind, the raising of Lazarus was the undisputed dramatic highlight of the film. You see the actor Robert Powell, who is told that Lazarus is ill. Someone comes up to him on a horseback and says, Lazarus is ill. The next scene, you see the sisters running up to him and being very blunt with Jesus and saying, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. The film actually sticks very close to the Gospels. They use some scripture scholars to help them with the script. And then there's a wide shot of this tomb, this kind of little opening. Actually, a stone is already over it. And Jesus comes to the tomb and shouts out in a very British accent, because Robert Powell was British. And we all know, of course, in these movies that Jesus speaks with a British accent. At least he did in the 60s and 70s. He shouts out, Lazarus, come forth. I can't do a British accent. And there's a big sort of surge of music in the orchestra, and you see this little figure coming out of the tomb. It's really powerful, and everybody just sort of shrinks back in terror. Some people fall to their knees. And that really made an impression on me when I was 16 years old. And I just wondered, who is this guy? And, who is he? Where did he come from? And why do we not know more about him? And why is he not in the other gospel stories? And who are these sisters, Mary and Martha, who speak so bluntly to Jesus, right? I mean, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. That's a really blunt thing to say to Jesus. So the visual power and the drama of the story really stuck with me for years and years and years. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, I was doing research for a book called Jesus, a Pilgrimage, which I think I actually talked about in one of these webinars. And I was over there in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, and I was staying at a Jesuit community called the Pontifical Biblical Institute, which is actually less a school and more of a community. And the superior of the Jesuit community said to me, well, where would you like to go? I was with another Jesuit friend. And I said, oh, well, the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum and Gethsemane and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he said, well, what about Lazarus's tomb? And I said, Lazarus's tomb? What are you talking about? And he said, well, you can see Lazarus's tomb in Bethany, which is today called very beautifully Al-Azariya in Arabic. It's in Palestinian territory. And not as many pilgrims go there. And I said, I definitely want to go see Lazarus's tomb. So I went to Lazarus's tomb in this small town of Al-Azariya, the place of Lazarus. And you go up a little hill. It's near the Church of St. Lazarus. And there's a door and kind of it's very hard to describe. It sort of goes down into this stone passage. And there you are in this tomb, usually by yourself because there's not a lot of pilgrims there. And when I was praying there, I thought of, which really is the theme of the book, what do I need to leave behind in the tomb? Because I was all by myself and I thought, gosh, how can I pray down here? What do I want? What's the kind of composition of place that I'm called to do? So I thought about that. What do I want to leave behind in the tomb? And I really, we all have things that kind of keep us bound, keep us unfree. What St. Ignatius was called a disordered attachment. So I left it behind the tomb. It was very emotional. I came out kind of into the sunlight, sort of imagining God calling me into new life. It was a very powerful experience for me. And about 4 or 5 years later, after the book came out, America Media, where I work, started to do pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And I said, well, we definitely want to go to Lazarus's tomb. Even again, not a lot of pilgrims groups go there. When you're there, there's not mobs and mobs of people. And I thought, well, I'm going to ask the pilgrims or invite the pilgrims to do the same kind of meditation, which I think I'd invite you to do, as you read this story and, hopefully buy the book and think about it, which is to imagine yourself in this tomb and to say, what are the things that I would really want to let go of, right? How can I hear Jesus's voice in my own life calling me into new life, right? And can I trust that? Lazarus had to trust in Jesus's voice. He heard the voice, wherever he was, kind of dead or heaven or hell or wherever he was, but he had to kind of respond to that voice. And we all hear God's invitation in our lives, but often things kind of keep us bound and keep us unfree and keep us from hearing the voice. So in any event, I suggested to some of these pilgrims that they do this. And it was very powerful for them. People would come out of the tomb crying. And so I thought, well, look, I really need to write a book on this. And I started it about 5 or 6 years ago, even before the pandemic. And the book is a combination of biblical exegesis, meaning kind of looking at the gospel story step by step, almost line by line sometimes, to really kind of open it up and see what each part of the story has to tell us, right? What it can do for us, right? And then second, some spirituality, right? The kinds of things I was just mentioning, what kinds of things do we need to let die? But also looking at the spiritual lessons of the story. A little bit of a travelogue, right? Looking at the current day Bethany and what it's like there and what it's like to visit the tomb. And then Lazarus through art and culture. So the book, for example, I don't know if you can see it. I'll try to hold it up. The book has lots and lots of illustrations. So there is Martha, for example, because Lazarus is a very popular figure in popular culture and in the fine arts. So I go through a lot of his depictions. Let's see if I can find another page of how he has been portrayed. There are two pictures. There's one. Oops, you can't. Oh, you can kind of see it. Oh, I guess you can't see it. I'll hold up something else. Here is an icon of Lazarus that a friend of mine did, Bill McNichols. It's an icon of Lazarus. That's Lazarus of Bethany. He looks a little ghostly there because of the focus. And then here's another icon that Bill McNichols did of coming out of the tomb of Lazarus. You can see that a little bit better. That's actually what the tomb looks like. So there's all sorts of images in the book as well. And so it's also a cultural history of Lazarus. Okay, so enough about the book. What can we know about Lazarus? The first thing is, did Lazarus really exist, right? I mean, is this just some sort of made up name or made up story or what? Is this some sort of kind of parable that the Gospel of John made up? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can know there's a couple of ways that we can know that people in the Gospels are historical characters, right? So, and that we know we have a sort of a connection to them. So, for example, in a lot of gospel passages, Jesus heals an unnamed person, right? A woman with a hemorrhage, or a Samaritan woman when he talks to at the well, or a leper, right? Or a tax collector, right? And we don't know their names. Why do we not know their names? Well, basically because the disciples may not have known their names. This person may have come out of a crowd, been healed, and go back, right? The early church didn't know their names. But sometimes when we know the names of people in the Gospels who are outside the apostles, right? Outside Peter and James and John and all the rest, we know names like Bartimaeus or Nicodemus, right? I'm blanking, Joseph of Arimathea, right? We know these names. Now, scripture scholars tell us that when we know the names of these people, it is because the early church knew of them. They were still well known in the early church. And so it is an argument for their historicity. And three of those people are Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, okay? And Mary and Martha, we know, are even in the Gospel of Luke. So we can be pretty sure that Lazarus existed. I'm 100% sure that Lazarus existed. But the question I go back to, and that sort of troubled me when I was a youth, was why is Lazarus not in the other Gospels? So the subtitle of this book is The Promise of Jesus's Greatest Miracle, all right? And the raising of Lazarus comes at the end of what's called the book of signs in John's Gospel. That's the first half of John's Gospel. All the signs that Jesus does, they're not called miracles or works of power as they are in the Synoptic Gospels. They're signs meant to help us believe. And Lazarus is the greatest of these signs. But it always used to trouble me, like, well, if this is the greatest of Jesus's miracles, why isn't it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? So I do a little exploration in the book, and I've read a lot of scripture scholars, New Testament scholars on this, and most of them point out that the Gospel of John is really more concerned with the things that happen in Judea, which is in the south, than Galilee up north, the focus of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if we think about it, there already are other stories of Jesus raising people from the dead in the synoptics. Now, we tend to think when we hear Jesus raising people from the dead, and by the way, Jesus himself says he raises people from the dead. Remember when John the Baptist's friends come to Jesus when John the Baptist is in jail, and they say, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?" And Jesus says, "Go tell John the Baptist what you see. The lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see, and the dead are raised." So Jesus himself talks about raising people from the dead himself. But it's not just Lazarus. Jesus raises from the dead the son of the widow of Nain. Remember that? There's a town called Nain, still there. You can visit it. And there's a man coming out on a bier, a funeral procession, and a mother is there, the widow. So it's a double loss for her son, but she's also a widow, right? So in that culture, she would have had, very little in terms of people taking care of her, right? It's a whole other discussion. But so Jesus raises this guy from the dead, and then also the daughter of Jairus, okay? So scripture scholars say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke may have known of the raising of Lazarus, but they already had in their gospel stories of people being raised from the dead. And as one scholar said, they may not have known of the huge theological masterpiece that was the raising of Lazarus that we just read in John's gospel. But there's an interesting connection between Lazarus in John's gospel and another gospel. You remember in the Gospel of Luke, there's the parable of what's called Lazarus and Dives. Remember that? Lazarus and Dives, Lazarus and the rich man. And the rich man, Lazarus, is the poor person who's sitting outside the guy's gate, and they both go to the afterlife, and the poor person is doing pretty well, and the rich man is not, sometimes called Dives, for the Latin word for rich. And he says, "Oh, send Lazarus back to warn my brothers," right? And the parable is about, kind of helping the poor. But as a number of scripture scholars point out, we have a parable about someone coming back from the dead named Lazarus. Is that interesting? So a lot of people think today that Luke would have known of the tradition of Lazarus in John's community and kind of imported that name into that parable, because it is the only parable that where the person has a proper name. So there's a little bit of a connection there. Now, one of the other interesting things about Lazarus is, I think, sort of the most enjoyable part of the book is a little bit of detective work, is whether or not Lazarus is the beloved disciple. Now, what does that mean? The beloved disciple is a kind of mysterious figure whose identity has not really ever been known for sure in John's gospel. Now, a lot of people think the beloved disciple is John, the writer of John's gospel, or whoever the writer of John's gospel was. Some people think it's the Apostle Thomas. Some people think it's Mary Magdalene. That's less likely because, remember, at the foot of the cross, Jesus says to the beloved disciple, "Son, here is your mother." So it's less likely that it's a woman. So people don't quite know who the beloved disciple is. It's been a kind of, detective work for scripture scholars over the last 2 millennia. But increasingly, a number of people say that there are arguments that say that it could be Lazarus. Now, why is that? Well, the beloved disciple who is the beloved disciple? He's really the source of a lot of the stories in John's gospel, and he's referred to as the beloved disciple. However, so here are some proofs. The beloved disciple doesn't make his appearance until after the story of Lazarus. Now, remember, Lazarus is called very touchingly when the sisters send word. We just heard in the story I read, the gospel story, when the sisters send word to Jesus that their brother is ill. What did they say? They don't say, "Lazarus, our brother is ill." They don't say, "Lazarus, your disciple is ill." They don't even say what you would expect someone in the Gospels to say, "Lazarus of Bethany is ill." They say, "He whom you love." Isn't that beautiful? It's a real sign of the affection that Jesus must have had for Lazarus. He whom you love is ill. All right. Now, he whom you love, he's the beloved one. All right. So there's an early sign that Lazarus might be the beloved disciple. But one of the keys is that the beloved disciple does not make his appearance in John's gospel until after this story. It is as if the story of Lazarus is the introduction to the beloved disciple. All right, so there's lots of other little clues like that. One of the most powerful is in John 21. Remember, at the end of John's gospel, the risen Christ appears to the disciples. He's on the seashore, remember, grilling fish. And the beloved disciple and Peter are in a boat. They're fishing. It's on the Sea of Galilee. And the beloved disciple said, it is the Lord. He recognizes him. Peter jumps in the water. They all go to the shore. Then there's this dialogue with Peter. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. He asks him 3 times to counterbalance the triple denial that Jesus has in the Passion. And then feed my sheep. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep. But then at the end of this dialogue, where, it's Peter talking to the risen Christ, a pretty important conversation. Peter says, well, what about him? Pointing to the beloved disciple. And Jesus says, well, if it's, what business is this of yours if he remain until I come back? And then John's gospel says, and the rumor arose that this disciple would not die. Now, scripture scholars say that makes no sense about anyone other than Lazarus, or at least Lazarus fits the bill better, right? Because why would they say a rumor arose that some Galilean fisherman or tax collector wouldn't die? So it really fits the story of Lazarus. There's lots of other parallels and sort of interesting clues about the beloved disciple. Remember, when the beloved disciple gets to the tomb first, okay, why does he get to the tomb first? Well, if he's faster than Peter, well, if he's Lazarus, he knows the area better. He's from Judea, not from Galilee. He gets to the tomb faster. He peers in. What does he see? He sees the grave cloths and the sudarion, the head covering. That's the Greek word for head covering. And he believes. Now, how does the beloved disciple believe? Well, some people say the beloved disciple is just kind of a sort of a stand-in for us, like we should all be the beloved disciple, the one who leans his head on Jesus's chest at the Last Supper, the one who is at the cross, the one who believes. But you could also say that one of the reasons that the beloved disciple believes that Jesus is risen is because if he's Lazarus, he himself had just been raised from the dead. Okay, so he understood that. And interestingly, scripture scholars say, a really nice parallel, that when Jesus comes out of the tomb, when Lazarus comes out of the tomb, he's wearing his grave cloths and his sudarion, his head covering. Okay, he's going to need his again, because he's going to die again. Jesus, you remember, leaves his grave cloths and his sudarion rolled up in the tomb. He's not going to need his again. All right, so really interesting parallel. So there's lots of internal proofs, I think, that show that Lazarus has a good claim to be the beloved disciple. Now, so that's a little bit about our hero of the story, Lazarus. I was going to show you this picture, but I think you can remember it. But there are other characters in the story. Of course, the real main character is Jesus. I talk a lot in the book about what the story tells us about Jesus. But we also have the characters of Martha and Mary, right? Martha and Mary are just so wonderful. They're so blunt with Jesus, aren't they? Both of them say the exact same thing, word for word. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, right? Really powerful. Now, a lot of people see that as a profession of faith, but I think you could also see that as them being blunt, okay? And I think what's interesting is that their characters are very similar, that their personalities, the personalities of Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, are very similar to their personalities in the Gospel of Luke. All right, so in the Gospel of Luke, probably the most famous story about Martha and Mary is when Martha and Mary are hosting Jesus in their house. Interestingly, Martha's house, not Lazarus's house. Very curious. I talk about that in the book. And Martha's doing all the work, and she says to Jesus, Lord, I'm doing all the work. Don't you care? Tell her to help me. Tell my sister to help me. Who talks to Jesus like that? By the way, as an aside, I relied on a lot of scripture scholars, particularly Brendan Byrne, an Australian scripture scholar, Francis Maloney, another Australian, Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish New Testament scholar, Michael Peppard, and Ben Witherington, a Protestant scripture scholar. And I sent the manuscript to them. And one of the things that Amy Jill Levine pointed out, she said, in that when you refer to that gospel passage in Luke of the two sisters, you say that Martha is cooking. Why do you say that? And that they're preparing a meal for Jesus. There's no meal there. Now, some of you who are, kind of lifelong Catholics might be surprised at this. I said, oh, of course there's a meal in that story. Martha is preparing the meal and Mary is not helping. Not at all. You go back and it says Martha is doing her diaconia. Isn't that interesting? Her service, her ministry. Amy Jo Levine said one of the reasons we have relegated her to peeling potatoes is probably because we are uncomfortable with the connection between Martha and diaconia, whence we get the word deacon from. All right. By the way, a topic of conversation at the synod last month in Rome, which seems like last year already. So Martha complains that Mary, who is sitting at Jesus's feet, is not pulling her weight. But Jesus, of course, says she has chosen the better part. Now, in that passage, Martha is the active one and Mary is the contemplative one. Okay, I think we need to be both active and contemplative. Similarly, in John's gospel, Martha rushes out to meet Jesus. She's active. Mary stays behind. Isn't that interesting? Mary stays behind, and when she finally does go out to greet Jesus, what does she do? She kneels at his feet, the same way that she does in Luke's gospel. So really interesting kind of parallels. But one of the amazing things for me about Martha and Mary is, particularly Martha, is that they show us the value of honesty. Now, they say to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha says to Jesus in Luke's gospel, tell her to help me. I mean, who talks like that to Jesus? And it's a reminder that, they must have been very close for them to talk to Jesus so bluntly. We only talk to people like that who we know, right? Maybe a brother or a sister or, a super close friend. Like, stop doing that, right? We don't talk to our boss like that or someone we don't know. So it's a sign of their intimacy with Jesus, which is very beautiful. And coupled with the idea of he whom you love, Jesus must have been very close to all three of them. But it's a reminder for us, too, to be honest in prayer, huh? We need to be honest with Jesus in prayer, the way that Martha is honest. So, as I said, they come out and they sort of remonstrate with Jesus, who has been waiting. Now, why? It says accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and Mary, he waited for 2 days where he was. Why is that? By the time that he gets there, he's been dead for 4 days. So one day, Lazarus is dead. 2 days, Jesus waits, day in transit, and he gets there for 4 days. Why does Jesus wait? Well, in the Gospels, it says, so that they can see the glory of God. You can do something great, even greater than heal Lazarus. But also in John's Gospel, we have to remember that Jesus is always in command, right? Jesus is always in control. But there's kind of a practical reason, too. In those days, New Testament scholars tell us that Jews thought that the body, that the soul hovered around the body for at least 3 or 4 days. And so one of the reasons I think Jesus waited was to sort of ensure that people would know that, as he says, Lazarus is dead. Lazarus is dead. So he gets to the tomb and Jesus weeps. Now, it's probably one of the most well-known and maybe well-loved parts of the Bible. Jesus weeps, or Jesus began to weep more accurately. Why is that? Well, we all say, oh, well, Jesus, was sad for his friend or sad for Mary and Martha. Actually, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book because it's so surprising to people, the Greek words that are used connote anger. Jesus is frustrated or angry. Why is that? Well, probably because, as it's told in the Greek, he is kind of frustrated, maybe at death itself, maybe at the situation, but probably for the people's lack of belief. Even the crying, I talk about this in the book, the crying of Lazarus, the crying of Jesus is different. The tears of Jesus are different than the tears of Mary and Martha and their Jewish friends. They're sobbing or weeping or wailing. Jesus merely sheds tears. All right. So one of the important parts of the story is to really kind of unearth what's kind of really going on, to really kind of get at the real subtext of the story. Now, interestingly, Jesus says, take away the stone. That's one of my favorite parts of the story. Take away the stone. And why does he say that? I mean, Jesus could have snapped his fingers and Lazarus could have somehow appeared outside of the tomb, the way that Jesus appears behind closed doors, right, at Easter Sunday. But he says, take away the stone. And then when Lazarus comes out, he says, unbind him and let him go. It's a reminder that though the grace of new life and the grace of invitation and our response to it is again God's grace. We sometimes need help, right? And it's Jesus inviting, I think, the participation of the community. Take away the stone and unbind him. And it's a reminder that we too, in addition to, a lot of this book is about kind of personal freedom, but we're also called to help others be free, right? We're also called to help take away the stones for other people and unbind people, right? So it's a call for participation in the freedom that Jesus gives. Now, I'll tell you, this title, there's a little bit of a funny story behind this. What Jesus actually says to Lazarus is Lazare duro exo in Greek. Lazarus, come out, right? It's not really come forth, but many of you know the LGBTQ work I do, the ministry I do. When I said to my publisher, if I call this book Come Out, I'll never hear the end of it. So I called it Come Forth, sort of based on the film that I saw when I was 16, but also a little bit more, I guess, formal, come forth. But really in the Greek, it's come out. It's exo, out, which is the word that's used when Jesus casts out demons. Exodus is a road out, right? Exodus, hodos is a road. Synodos is walking together on a road. Exodos is a road out. So come out. And coming out is a really important thing for LGBTQ people, right? Kind of leaving behind the fear that people won't accept them, the fear that God doesn't love them, really, and coming out into the sunlight. But coming out and hearing God's voice is really the invitation for all of us. So the last question I wanted to talk about before we go to your questions is, what happens to Lazarus? Like, what happens to him? There's lots of different traditions. I talk about these traditions in the end of the book. In one tradition, believe it or not, Lazarus and Mary and Martha are cast aboard a boat without oars by some miscreants, right? And because the story is that Lazarus was seen, as kind of a too public proof of Jesus's power. By the way, a number of scripture scholars point out that in John's gospel, the tremendous reception that Jesus gets on Palm Sunday can be attributed to Lazarus. Lazarus is being raised from the dead. Because in John's gospel, it is the raising of Lazarus that sets in motion Jesus's crucifixion, because that's what happens. And so there's this interesting death. Lazarus's death leads to life. His life leads to Jesus's death, leads to our life. So there's a kind of interest, sort of a double Paschal mystery there. But anyway, in one tradition, Lazarus and his sisters are set aboard a boat, and it miraculously goes to Marseille, where he becomes the first bishop of Marseille. And I talk about in the book, there's a place, the Cathedral of Saint Lazare in Autun, I think in the Burgundy region, where Lazarus's relics supposedly lie. There's another tradition where he goes to Cyprus, and he becomes the first bishop of Cyprus, and then he dies there, and his relics somehow get transferred to Marseille. So in both of these stories, Lazarus's relics go to Marseille. But most likely, scholars say that Lazarus was murdered, okay? Because there's some indications of that in the gospel, in the Gospel of John, maybe because he was seen again as kind of too public a person for Jesus's opponents to leave behind. So a little bit about Lazarus. Finally, I want to ask you with some questions. And these are the main questions of the book. The first is, what are you called to leave behind in your tomb? Okay, we all have things that, I sure do. We all have things that keep us bound, that keep us unfree, that are burdens on us, okay? Maybe it's an unhealthy pattern of behavior, some sort of addiction. Maybe you're mean to people. Maybe you always like to be right. Maybe you're lazy. Maybe you're too focused on yourself. There are a million different things that we can have that keep us from really responding to God's voice in our lives, right? So what are those things that you're called to let die? You might even do, and I talk about this in the book, doing a meditation of imagining yourself in the tomb, right? And I actually have pictures of the tomb. I'm very proud of this book, as I said, because there's tons and tons of pictures. And there, maybe you can kind of see it. Oh, it's in and out. Let's see if I can try that. No, you can't see it. Actually, there it is. There's the tomb. That's the stairway going into the tomb. You can kind of see it a little bit. So one of the meditations is, what are you called to leave behind in your tomb? Where is God calling you into new life? And how is God calling you into new life? And finally, how are you called to free others from their tombs and move away the stone and release them from their grave cloths? So a little bit about the book, Come Forth. I really hope you go out and buy it. It's on sale now. It's in print, ebook, audio, what else? And print, ebook, and audio. I guess that's it. I hope you like it. And now I'm happy to answer your questions about our friend Lazarus. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. The first question, imagine that Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were at one of the small group tables with you at the synod. What do you think they would have wanted to share with the church today? And what does their life as a family closely connect to Jesus speak to us?
Oh my gosh, that is the best question. Imagine Martha, Mary, and Lazarus at a small group table at the synod. Well, one of the things we talked about at the small groups was the role of women. And I can say this because it's been shared, we talked about women deacons. And I think Martha would probably say, I'm tired of being remembered as someone who just was in the kitchen when I was doing diaconia, right? And they might talk about their friend Mary Magdalene, right? And her role in the church. So I think the role of women. But also, one of the things we might say is, look at the story of our brother. Where is the church today called to leave behind things that are dead and not useful to us anymore? And where is it called to kind of move into new life? What does their life as a family closely connected to Jesus speak to us? I think there are a few stories of friendship well, let me put it this way. We tend to think of everyone who associated with Jesus as either like his family, like, Mary and Joseph, a disciple, the recipient of a healing, right? An opponent, but to remind us that Jesus had friends. I mean, Mary and Martha had a house where Jesus felt comfortable. And, a number of scholars, including Gerhard Lofing, say that we have to remember they're not called disciples, they're friends. They're friends of Jesus, he whom you love. So I think that their family, among other things, shows us that Jesus had friends and that we need friends just like Jesus did. And being a friend is a really important thing.
Did you address in the book the 4 days that Lazarus was actually dead? And what state was he in spiritually?
Yeah, I'm smiling because there's a lot of speculation about that. The answer is we don't know. We don't know where he is. Is he in purgatory? Is he in hell? Is he in heaven? I tell you, interestingly, I talk a lot about the fictional versions of Lazarus, a lot of the novels that were written about him in plays and stuff. One of the themes of many of the plays is that Lazarus doesn't want to come back. He's dead. And he says, why didn't you leave me there? It was really nice. So yeah, but we don't know. We don't know what state he was in spiritually. But, if you think about it kind of imaginatively, and by the way, I believe this story happened. I want to be clear about this. When I talk about it as a story, in some way, he had to have kind of responded, to Jesus's calling. So I imagine him almost like these near-death experiences where these people, hear the voices calling them back, or they hear a voice saying you have to come back. He has to choose to come back. So it's a great question, though.
I wonder if you could expand on what Mary Magdalene's service may have been if she was making dinner. What might she have been busy doing?
Well, I think we have to remember to distinguish between Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany. Now, some people think they're the same person, and Martha. So Mary Magdalene would have been a separate disciple. But Mary, in the story that we were talking about before, in the Gospel of Luke, Mary is sitting at Jesus's feet listening. That's the idea. And Jesus says to Martha, the sister, Mary has chosen the better part. Now, I think that's often used to denigrate the contemplative life, to denigrate the active life, like it's better to be contemplative and sitting at Jesus's feet. I mean, look, Jesus is very active himself, especially in John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. He's going from place to place and walking. I think what he's saying is that there's a time and a place for everything. We have to be both Martha and Mary. And I think that story is often used to, I talk about this in the book, to kind of denigrate active people. Oh, Martha, Martha, where we're supposed to be both.
Did people believe in the resurrection before Jesus died, as in Martha and Mary?
Many Jews did. So you remember they talk about in the gospel the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. That means that many Jews did. And of course, Martha says to Jesus, I believe he will rise in the last day. What Jesus does is kind of ups the ante and says, I am the resurrection. So they believe in resurrection in the end times, right? But Jesus is saying it's called a realized eschatology about the last thing. Realized because it's already there. Jesus is already in front of them. So it's a really great theological commentary. But the answer to your question is yes, they did. And here's some nice French. Quelles sont selon vous les meilleures façons de se défaire des fardeaux qui nous attachent, qui nous retiennent vers le passé? Okay, now I do need some translation. I can speak it, but I can't translate it.
I think they'll send it. I think that Albert or Michelle will send it to us. Let's go on and we'll come back.
Here we go.
Okay. Unmute yourself, Michelle.
Oh, you are muted. Go to the English okay. Go to the English interpretation. Let's see. Okay. Quelles sont selon vous les meilleures façons de se défaire des fardeaux qui nous attachent, qui nous retiennent vers le passé? All right, terrific. Thank you. Perfect. I think the first one would be to recognize them, to name them. I'm sorry, by the way, if I've been speaking too quickly. To name them, to recognize them, to seek out help if you need to, whether or not it's a spiritual director or therapist or even a friend. And then to really trust that God is calling you to let them go. I think one of the most important things to remember is that when you feel that God is inviting you to let go of something, to remember that it is God who's calling you. So it's not just a self-help thing. It's not just something that's psychologically important, which are both important things, but that it is God that is calling you. So that can give us a lot of confidence in listening to that voice. It's a great question.
Jesus, as God knows that Lazarus needs to be alive to fulfill a mission, could it be that because of close relationship, Lazarus has shown he has the wisdom and the qualities to be a spiritual leader?
That's interesting. I think that's a very speculative question. But I think, certainly Jesus loved Lazarus. We're told it's he whom you love. I've never thought about that. And that if he is the beloved disciple, he would have been one of the leaders in the community. So perhaps, yeah, I think part of the difficulty of answering that question is that we know so little about Lazarus. So it's a hard question to answer.
This is a question from the chat. How would you use this story of Lazarus when preparing the elect for the third scrutiny? I do not ask them what needs to be raised, brought to life as they prepare for I do ask them what needs to be raised and brought to life as they prepare for the initiation sacraments.
Well, I would say just what you said, to use the story, to ask them not only what needs to die, but what needs to be brought to life. Also, I talk about in the book, what is kind of rotten in you? Not that it's dead or needs to die, but other things that you're kind of embarrassed to look at. I think that's also a good question too, and to kind of bring them into the sunlight of God's love. And then also, particularly for, for catechumens, to say, do you really believe that the church can bring you new life, and that you could find new life in the community? And then finally, that question about take away the stone and untie him. Where are you? Because as you're being brought into the church, where are you being called to free other people in the community?
Could you please say a bit more about Jesus's emotional state? Those watching him saw his love. Sometimes sorrow and anger blend, but I find it hard to see him as being angry at his friends for not having faith. I myself have trouble believing that the dead rise.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question because, look, we don't know. Part of it is we rely on the Greek. So the Gospels are written in Greek, and originally they would have been in Aramaic. So we don't have access to the original Aramaic. But the words that are used are that he's frustrated, he's angry. It's hard for us to acknowledge, but deeply perturbed in spirit. The word that is used, embrimesato, I think, in other contexts in the Gospels, is when Jesus is frustrated. So it's hard to kind of access Jesus's feelings. I say in the book, I think it's probably a mixture of emotions, frustration, certainly sadness. But also remember that Jesus knows in some way that this is going to bring about his own death. And so it would have been a lot more complex than just kind of, not that I'm saying what you're saying is simplistic, but his emotions would have been more complex than just one, than sadness or frustration or anger. Might have been a little fear too. So it's a great verse. And I really spend a lot of time on it in the book because I know that's a hard thing for people to hear, but that is what the Greek says.
Is there anything you could share about what your next book may be about?
Oh, sure, I can share a lot. So I'm doing a little bit of a memoir. So this Lazarus book, as you can see, is pretty thick, and it has lots of pictures and footnotes, and there's a lot of sort of scholarly apparatus to it, but it's also very accessible, I hope. So my next book is a memoir of growing up in the 1970s through the lens of my summer jobs. So it's a lot of fun, no footnotes and no research. So I'm doing that, and then a book on faith, on important, like answering common questions about faith.
From your studies of the concept of a new life, how could we leave behind the tomb expectations driven by good intentions or frustrations from our past or the past of our loved ones?
Well, I think the past is something that sometimes needs to be left behind in the tomb. Obviously, past hurts and disappointments and resentments, and also kind of regrets that we have, right? And so I think that is, you're right, that is something that we need to sort of allow to let go of. We don't forget these things, but can we imaginatively and spiritually leave them behind in the tomb? And as I said, there are different ways of doing that. Talking to spiritual director, counselors, therapists, friends, right? Even maybe writing a list, maybe even sort of symbolically casting it aside. But the past is something that is often blocking people from hearing new life.
What would have been Martha's diaconal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we go back to the idea that Martha, I think there's a picture in the book actually of Martha and Mary. And when Martha, there it is, this is from Vermeer. I don't know if you can see it. There you go. So the famous picture of Jesus with Martha and Mary, I don't know if you can't really see that. Anyway, sorry about that. She's cooking, right? But again, as Amy Jill Levine pointed out, she's doing diaconia. Now, the diaconia could have been cooking. Diaconia means service, work, or ministry, okay? But she could have been doing something else. I guess the point is that we shouldn't just relegate her to cooking, and we shouldn't deny the fact that word is in there, diaconia, ministry or service.
How might we live the mystery that, yes, Christ sometimes raised people from the dead, but in our world today, raising people from the dead isn't always how God reveals God's self to us?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Why doesn't Jesus or God raise people from the dead today? And I don't know. I can't speak for God, but because there are other miracles that happen, maybe. I mean, I've been asked that question before. Maybe the sign is such a powerful sign that it is reserved to Jesus, right? And maybe that is just such a powerful miracle that it's reserved for the Son of God.
Is there any particular explanation for why the synoptics have not recorded this narrative, given that they were written before the fourth gospel?
Yeah, I talked about that at the beginning. You may have missed that part. So they're not in the synoptic. The story of Lazarus is not in the synoptic gospel. And briefly, it's probably because those gospels are focused more on Galilee, and there were already raising from the dead traditions, i.e., the son of the widow of Nain and the daughter of Jairus, that they were using for their gospels, and so they didn't see the need for another one. And there may also have been some subtle competition between the Judean kind of community and the Galilean community, so they left Lazarus out.
In Jean Vanier's commentary on John's gospel, he suggests that Lazarus might have been disabled, as the house in Bethany is referred to as Martha's home. Any comments on that possibility?
Yes, I've heard that before, and I talk about that in the book. The Bethany, one of the translations of Bethany is house of affliction. And so some people think that Lazarus, Martha, and Mary might even have been people who suffered from leprosy, from Hansen's disease, because Bethany might have been one of the three cities that were outside the temple, a certain distance away from the temple precincts for people who were considered unclean, right, or had impurities. So they may have been sick in that way. Lazarus, because he is not given any words to speak, might have been disabled, and you have Martha and Mary taking care of him. I mean, that's a very powerful thing when you think about Lazarus as being he whom you love. But Amy Jill Levine points out that women could own houses back then, so it wasn't unusual that there was Martha's house. I think what is unusual is that it's not called Lazarus's house. In other words, we know that there's a man there, although Lazarus might have been very young. Right? Who knows? Lazarus might have been 14, 15. Martha and Mary might have been, 20, 25 years old. But I have heard that possibility. And I think the idea of Bethany as house of affliction, Bethania, lends credibility to that possibility.
Why didn't Jesus or God not just unwrap him himself? What can we learn from this?
Yeah, again, I mean, the idea of Jesus being able to do that, Jesus could have snapped his fingers. I think what we learn is that Jesus asks us to participate in the miracle. He says, unbind him and let him go, which is asking the crowd to participate.
Wasn't it odd that Lazarus was not married, and odd that Martha and Mary were not married? Wasn't this a bit of an unconventional family?
Well, it is. They're all celibate, apparently, because they're not married. And again, it could be that they're taking care of their brother. It could be that they were lepers. It could be that they were members of the Essenes, which was a kind of a sect back then, but we don't really know. It is very curious. I talk about some of the possibilities in the book.
Father Martin, you say that Lazarus was raised. I had always read that Lazarus was brought back to mortal life, but not raised as we are promised to be on the last day. He would die again and would need to wait for his personal resurrection. Is this a distinction?
Yeah, it is. I mean, they do talk about, it is called the raising of Lazarus. That's the traditional way of looking at it. Lazarus is raised from the dead. There's usually a distinction sometimes made between the raising of Lazarus, and you're right, he dies again. As I said, that's one of the reasons he comes out with his grave cloths. We're not meant to imagine that Lazarus is going to live forever like Jesus. Resurrection is usually referred to, it is usually refers to Jesus. So that's a little bit of a distinction. So he's raised from the dead. He'll die again. Jesus is resurrected. So a little bit of a distinction. You're right.
From the context of Lazarus's resurrection and Jesus's emotions, what is the call and how should we respond to our church that sometimes takes a lot of time to leave in the tomb prejudices or lack of understanding of Scripture? This is particularly important for those who are expecting more from the synod, women, deacons, and blessings for same-sex couples.
Well, the first thing to say about the synod is that the synod is not a juridical body. So we could never make rules. We couldn't just say, okay, we're going to have women deacons now. I think what the synod is consultative. I mean, the Pope would do that. But the synod went very far in talking about women deacons and asked the Pope to look at it and to release the results of those commissions. So I want to be very clear what the synod can and cannot do, or could and could not do. Even in the second round, we can't change church teaching. We now the Pope can do that. We can suggest that. So very important. But that's a really good question, because the one of the stories of Lazarus is that the sisters are waiting. They're waiting for Jesus, and it's a kind of hopeful and expectant waiting that we are called to, not a kind of waiting of just fate or it's all up to the stars, or a kind of waiting of despair, nothing will ever change, but it's a hopeful waiting. It's a Christian waiting. So I think part of it is it does take a lot of time, right? And it does take time. And as they say, the church thinks in centuries, but not minutes. But look, even today, just a few hours ago, the Vatican released a statement saying that transgender people can be baptized, serve as godparents, and witnesses at a wedding. That is a change, right? So things do happen. It's just a question of being patient.
How do you portray the resurrection of the dead at the end of times on heaven and in earth?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I mean, how do I imagine it? I guess would be, gosh, I guess all of us being reunited with our loved ones on the end times. And that's how I think of it. It's something that's kind of beyond me to explain.
The next question, I'll read the English translation.
Oh, great.
Jesus experiences strong emotions. What do you think he wants to teach us, especially as Christ the companion?
Oh, what a great, I've never heard Christ the companion. That's a great title. I love that. Christ accompagnateur. Well, first of all, I mean, he's human, right? And we have to remember, whatever we were talking about, the emotions that Jesus has around Lazarus's tomb, he weeps, he's human. So one thing we have to remember about that story is he's doing something that is physically human. So it's not just God kind of pretending to be human. He is crying. I think just the value of humanity, the value of his incarnation, which is also reminding us of the value of our incarnation, right? That we are in a body too, right? And so my spiritual director said to me once when I was complaining about some illness, he said, "You don't like the incarnation much." I said, "What do you mean?" "Of course I like the incarnation." He said, "No, you don't like your incarnation." So it's about sort of being okay with being human and having a body.
Is there a warning for us in that to not only serve diakonia, but to free people and make them meet directly the Christ, to have a relationship with him, contemplative?
Oh, I see. I see. I don't know if it's a warning as much of it as an invitation. So in the gospel story of Luke, we have Martha and Mary. Martha is the active one and Mary is the contemplative one. And Jesus says she's chosen the better part. I think it's a question of kind of being both and knowing that there's a right time for each one.
If the relics of Lazarus are in Marseille, is there a link to be made with Lazarus's rising from the dead to the global refugee situation, linking that with the Pope's recent visit to France?
Oh, that's beautiful. I think there's always a way to connect those beautiful gospel stories with the plight of the poor. Yeah, I mean, maybe that we call refugees to and migrants to new life, by caring for them or by unwrapping them or taking away the stone of people's indifference. That's what I would say.
Why is it that Jesus said to Martha, Mary has chosen the better part when Martha was doing diaconia?
Because the idea was that Jesus is saying that there's a time and place for everything, and there's a time for contemplation. Maybe a few more questions because I can see people kind of trailing off. Yeah.
The stone that covered the tomb is a big, heavy concrete. It takes several men to open it. Does Jesus imply that faith is not the only way, but we need counsels from others, from spiritual leaders and others close to us who see our real self? Jesus orders Lazarus to come out. Is it a calling to a mission, a change, the voice of God calling?
I will answer that first question. Does Jesus imply that faith is not the only way, but we need counsel? Yeah, we need the help of others. I think Jesus is telling the community to help free Lazarus, but also is reminding us that we need to help free other people. The next part, is it a calling to a mission and change? Yeah, I guess you could say that. It's calling a new life. What he's doing to Lazarus at the moment is healing him, and also I would say providing a sign for people. It's very important to see it as a sign for people to believe. Maybe two more questions, if that's okay. It's kind of late too.
Yeah. Perhaps a lot of people were angry at Jesus for not being there to prevent Lazarus's death and were demanding a miracle. Could this be a reason for Jesus's frustration?
No, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. We're demanding a miracle. A lot of people are angry. That's very interesting. I never thought of that. And the answer is yes. But it's funny because he comes to do the miracle. He comes to do the sign. That's right. Look, I think part of it is a lot of this is up for our speculation. You can, if you read the book and kind of look at how I take apart the Greek, you can come to your own conclusion. But I think that's a great insight.
And the final question, apart from the influence of movies in your younger years that depicted this miracle, what role, if any, did this scriptural vignette play in your ongoing discernment for ministry and thereafter, if any?
Well, that's a great question to end on. I always think about this story almost every day. There are lots of things about me that need to die. Just a mess, all sorts of things. I'm not perfect. Even if you don't know me, I'm sure you know I'm not perfect because I'm a human being. And I think about this story every day. Where am I being called to let go of things? It's very much like the Paschal mystery. The central story of our life as Christians, as Catholics, is the Paschal mystery, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And we're all called to die to self. But the story of Lazarus, I think, is sometimes even more accessible because it's about a guy who's, he's not the son of God. And Jesus calls him into life. So it's always letting things go. Listen, I want to thank everybody. I'm sorry I'm flagging. I'm still a little jet lagged. It's kind of tough, but I'm sorry I can't answer all your questions. I do want to say once again, this book is on sale in print, audio, and ebook, and it's lavishly illustrated. We'll answer all your questions about Lazarus, and it really will help you kind of experience new life. So I want to thank very much the Jesuits of Canada, Patricia, everybody who helped set this up, and thank you for joining us. So many people, which is just so amazing. I'm really grateful. So thanks so much, and keeping your prayers.
Jim, it's my pleasure to thank you for this enlightening and informative presentation on your new book. You've given us an understanding of what Jesus means when he calls us to come forth or come out. Your reflections on Jesus's lessons on love, frustration, sadness, fear, anger, freedom, and family provide us with deep spiritual lessons. Your words about Lazarus open us up to find God in all things. Looking ahead in our webinar series for November, Next week, on Thursday, November 16th, Dr. Dawn Goldstein joins us for Bridging the Spiritual Exercises and the 12 Steps. Father Edward Dowling's contribution to the spirituality of recovery. And then on January the 11th, Father David Newhouse will be back with us to talk about the current situation in the Holy Land. Our prayers are with him and all the people impacted by this terrible war. Thanks to David and Fanny for their technical support and contribution to our webinar, and our translators, Michelle and Albert. And finally, thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. We hope to see you next week. Good night.
Good night. Bonne nuit.